Hello, you're listening to the K-12 Tech Podcast, bringing you insights into the world of education technology. Stay tuned as we discuss the past, the present, and most importantly, the future of technology in our schools. Marlo, thank you for being on the second episode of the Origins podcast. Marlo, is that full name?
So it is my full first name.
Yeah.
Yes. I was named after Marlo Thomas originally.
Awesome.
But strangely enough, my parents realized afterwards that my name is half my mother's, half my father's. So my mother's name is Margaret. My father's name is Lauren. So 2 for 1.
I love that. So on the Origins podcast, what we try to cover is specifically a CTO or tech director's journey to how they got to where they are now. And for a lot of people, it could feel like a daunting journey. I think your story in particular, I'm really interested to hear. So to start out, the first question I have is when did you know you even wanted to go into education? When was that turning point for you?
I would say probably as long as I was playing, I was usually the teacher. That probably early age, like 3, 4, 5 years old. Now we say I was I was already showing examples of leadership at that age, but back then I was bossy, right? So for a girl back then. So, but no, I knew I wanted to be a teacher early on, and really wanted to do that most of my life. And then when I was in college, North Carolina had a scholarship called the Teaching Fellows, and so I applied for that and got that, and then nothing like having a free tuition for college, especially now knowing I have a child going to school and I'm going to be paying tuition.
Yeah.
It's a little bit more appreciative now of that. But yeah, I knew early on I wanted to be a teacher and thought for sure I would do that my whole life.
That's awesome. I think specifically for teaching, there are just a lot of people who just felt like called into that and wanting to like really change the fabric of education for young students.
Yeah, I think nowadays less people are being called because we know the trouble that the education field is going through right now, and so I think less people are called. But I do think it has to be a calling at this stage.
What can you give me a few examples of what you would say are like hindering people feeling called into education now than maybe in the past?
Yeah, I think obviously the number one is salary, right?
Okay.
Most of our teachers now barely make a living wage. So I think salary is certainly one of those things. And I would also say the politics of education. And, when I went into education, teachers were revered, right? Teachers were great. Parents supported teachers. Now, teachers go through a lot more now than they ever did when I started out as a teacher.
Do you think that's all people's just voice, people being able to make a voice louder now with like social media and emailing? Okay.
Yeah, I do, definitely.
Yeah, because it's not just like, a parent stopping by and saying, hey, like, I don't like this. It's now just like you can really stir up probably a lot of drama pretty quickly.
And rules of engagement have changed in general for education. So I think there's probably a lot of reasons why that is the case right now. And, of course, we're all feeling it now with education shortages in teaching and leadership all around.
Yeah. So going into college, where'd you go to college at?
I went to Elon College, which is now Elon University, which is in Elon, North Carolina. So about 30 minutes outside of Greensboro, an hour out of Raleigh.
How big of a school is that?
Back then it was a fairly small school, but now, as I said, they're a university, and I'm proud. I live 5 minutes from the university myself now, so it's a great school and very proud of it.
That's awesome. So in college, obviously you were an education major. Like, what stuff were you interested in? Like, was there anything in particular you felt yourself like moving towards and like learning during that process?
When I was in college, I thought all I was going to be was a teacher, and I said that wrong, and I want to correct myself.
Okay.
What I thought I wanted to be was the teacher for the rest of my life, because I thought the teachers were the highest level of calling that you could have. And so I really wasn't looking outside of that during that period of time. My only debate at that point in time was what age group and what subjects do I want to teach. I actually went into teaching into college as a double history and English major, going to teach high school.
Yeah.
And that was because I had two amazing teachers in high school, English and history, who really made that come alive for me. What I learned very quickly is I am very much a little kid person. And so I ended up teaching kindergarten and first grade, and love that age group still today.
What about that age group did you really like comparatively to the older age group?
Early literacy and early school experiences set the tone for kids at that age. So at that age, students still love their teachers. They also need care and conversation, and just exposure to life, and manners and respect and all the things that we don't really get into much anymore, but just understanding how to socialize with one another and how to talk to one another. And I really enjoy little kids because they are great storytellers. And sometimes those stories go on for a very long time, but otherwise, they're just fun to have.
Yeah. Do you think, and you may have tapped onto this a little bit, but do you think if a child has a really rough experience in those first years, kindergarten, first grade, it like impacts how they look at school the rest of the time?
I mean, we have history of that. I think there's research, and I can't off the top of my head quote the research, but even just having one teacher or one adult that negatively affects a life can really make a huge difference. If that's the case, kids close their minds out to school. They close their minds out to a lot of things. On the contrary, when adults take an interest in kids and make them feel seen and heard and understood, then there's a lot more things that can happen to benefit kids. So unfortunately, everything is an impact, whether that's in teaching or parenting. As a parent myself, I can speak to that as well. So.
Yeah, I can speak to that personally. So like I was always like very, very energetic. I'll say that, maybe not hyper energetic. And kindergarten and first grade, I remember just hating because it was like
sit in a seat.
This is how you learn and everything, and hated school. And then I had a really good string of 3 teachers that were patient with me and cared, and they like, I don't know, you just felt loved as a student, and it like completely turned me around, and I like enjoyed learning more, and I just really appreciated that. And I think if I would have had another couple of years of just being, and I understand as a teacher, when you have kids that are difficult, like it's a whole group of kids, but that could have drastically changed my education, like for the rest of it.
Well, the truth of the matter is everybody's a handful, but you have to understand what the needs are of each child. My son had a teacher early in his life who he and a couple other boys were very active. And it wasn't that they were misbehaving, they were just active. And not, to your point, not wanting to sit in seats, and had movement needs. And he despised that class. Yeah. But the next year's teacher actually had a space for him when he needed to get up and move. She let him know, when you need to move, here's the space that you can move. And to this day, he still adores that teacher because she understood and recognized what he needed and then met that need.
Yeah, I love that. If I would have had that early on, just be like, hey, I feel like, because I talk to my kids about this because I want them to feel like they're heard and they understand and I can relate with them. But I tell them, like, there was a time where I would have been labeled maybe as a bad kid, but it truly was like, they're like, sit down, keep your hands like, basically like keep your hands on the table. It's like, I couldn't physically do it. And it's hard to explain that to people. And I think teachers that can identify, and we have a lot more research now.
We do.
Than probably back then. But how that can drastically change just someone's outlook on that. So
absolutely.
That's incredible. So you're a kindergarten teacher. Why don't you walk me through the first couple of years of that, and then how you started transitioning into different.
So I started as a kindergarten teacher and then took my first class up with me, or a lot of my first class up with me to first grade. So I did kindergarten for a year, and then I did first grade for several. And I'm going to show my age. At the time, we were just getting computers in schools. Yeah. So the Apple IIe, Apple IICs, back in the day, we were just now getting labs of those. The internet was just, AOL had just kind of started in that process. And so the school district I worked for at that time started requiring some technology classes. And I went into a HyperStudio class. That really is showing my age now, if you know what HyperStudio is.
I don't.
It's like the early stages of PowerPoint. So it was a card deck, basically like PowerPoint, but HyperStudio. And I went from, I immediately loved it. Initially just absolutely adored it. And then decided that, I had a friend who taught the class, and then she's like, well, why don't you sub for me and teach the class some? And so I started teaching some of the technology workshops for the district. And
how
so that was fun.
How many years of teaching are you into at this point?
I think I was in 3 or 4 at this point in time. And so I really started to, where I have a passion for education, but what I found is I had a proclivity for technology.
Yeah.
And so I decided I wanted to combine the two. And around that time, the district started having technology teachers.
Yeah.
And so I went to a different school, and taught technology for a couple of years. Worked for a phenomenal Title I school. And Title I schools do not get the credit that they are deserved, because there is not a harder group of teachers than those teachers, I will tell you.
Can you explain really quick what a Title I school is?
Sure. So our Title I schools are usually schools that have low socioeconomic status, so students who are coming from poverty quite often. So we spend a lot of time working to meet the needs of kids. And I worked with an exceptional group of people who did that. And so I'm blessed to have spent just a little bit of time with those folks in that role, because you do have so much. You don't have. It's not typical of all schools, but quite often you don't have PTAs. You don't have volunteers who are in the classroom all the time, and teachers are determined and have that passion for meeting the needs of kids. And so sometimes you have to do a lot more to make sure those needs are met. And so just a great group of teachers that work in the school I worked at specifically. So
being a technology teacher, that's very early on. You're talking about even something I've never even heard before. Yeah. What are you teaching? What level are you teaching?
Word processing, databases, spreadsheets. It was the early days, and back then it wasn't even Microsoft. It was AppleWorks and ClarisWorks, and so we taught a lot of that work, and nothing beats a bunch of kids who
Oregon Trail training.
No, you can do that though. I have a funny story about that later I can share with you. But yeah, some of the mech software that you would play with. Certainly, Oregon Trail was part of that. But nothing like kids learning how to change a font, change a color, and then how to have it read aloud to you. Elementary kids. Always great. Every year, at least one third grader would write something in an appropriate word and have it read it aloud. So it always had to happen. But
you can say it. You can say it if you want.
No, I'm going to say it. That's okay. But from that perspective, that's really kind of what I was teaching for a few years.
That's awesome. So, you were doing that in elementary school. I'm guessing it was more in a computer lab setting.
It was.
Yeah.
It was.
And was that similarly you were one teacher for one age group, or were you basically the lab?
I was the lab, and all the class. I worked in a special. So I was
Gotcha.
With art, music, PE. I was another place that everybody attended once a week. I'd see them each.
That's awesome. So that's obviously 3-4 years. That's very early on into a teaching career to start.
I'm now in my 6th and 7th year at this point in time doing that. So then the district started a technology facilitator position for the district and providing training for schools. So I took on that role for a few years, and then took a detour for a couple years and worked with the curriculum department in math, science, and social studies.
Okay.
Was their lead teacher for elementary in those topics. And then went back to technology because I still love it. And, kind of led all of the elementary schools at that point in time, all the training, but also all the technical aspects. So I had a team of technicians that I worked with at that point in time that solved that.
So obviously are these jobs opening up and then people are saying you should go apply, or are you the one seeking them out? I think that's a lot of what we're trying to tackle on this series is, was this something where people identified that as a talent that you had, or was that you seeking those out and applying and going after those positions?
I'd say probably for most of it, it was me applying.
Yeah.
I think part of what people don't necessarily pay attention to is what's out there and then being willing to give it a shot. Right. So,
yeah.
I wasn't planning to go into curriculum, but saw there was a job opening and I was like, those are the subjects I really like. So maybe I'll throw my name in the hat, and then got the role. So sometimes you just have to see the open doors and recognize that maybe it's something you're interested in. I do think there's a little faith that has to come from that too, is know that when you don't get something, it's, it just wasn't meant to be.
Yeah, I hear that story a lot because we work with tons of different tech departments. They're like, oh, why didn't you put your name in the hat for this position or that position? And a reply I got a lot was, well, I had applied for something similar and I didn't get it. And it's some people give up at that point.
Yeah, I don't understand that aspect because I do think, I got into being a CTO late in my career. Mm-hmm. Like my career was a long, I see people now in their 20s being technology directors and CTOs, and I'm thinking how wonderful, right?
Yeah.
Because now we have them for a good bit of time. Mine was later in my career, my last 5 years of my career when I took over that role. So I think it's, I think you just have to be willing to see it, know if it's something you're interested in, right? But because I definitely don't think somebody should not apply unless it's something that just doesn't interest them. But it never hurts. And I used to tell my team all the time, everybody can use a little interviewing practice.
Yeah.
So it's always just go into it with an open mind.
Is there a characteristic, if let's say you're a teacher or someone going and applying for a new job inside of the district that isn't necessarily a teacher, is there a characteristic that you feel like superintendents or COOs of a school are like looking for when they're hiring? Is it confidence? Is it the focus on like being education first? Because I know for a lot of people it might feel like I just don't have what it takes, or people who might be really good but are really timid and don't know how to prepare for that.
Yeah, I think it depends on the role, right? So if you're a teacher, obviously you gotta like kids. That sounds like basic, but we get people who don't like kids who are in education. So I think the first thing we're looking for is people who actually like students and like working with students.
Yeah.
I think that's an important characteristic. And then I think it depends on where you are, right? So I think there are a lot of people who hire for skills. I don't believe in hiring necessarily for skills. I believe in soft skills. So I want to know that you collaborate. I want to know that you can problem solve. I want to know that that you're a decent human being and then you get along with others. I can teach you the other stuff, and we can work your way up. It just depends on how technical a position is, and whether there are HR requirements around those types of things. But I would much rather hire somebody who is a decent human being that I can train and is willing to learn, versus somebody who thinks they know it all and has experience.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more on that. Yeah. The soft skills, an aspect, and you might agree with this, is someone's ability to teach themselves how to do things. Mm-hmm. So valuable, so important. And then their ability to work together as a team into like, I always tell my team, the 3 words, that you never say to me is that's not my job. Because if you're being asked, like your job is to be part of a team and to make sure that
it's called other duties as assigned. Everybody has it as their job description. So anything can be given to you for sure.
Yeah. And you're right. The people who can work together as a team and then take on responsibility and do it to the best of their ability. You can teach people like that. People who already know it can't teach.
Correct.
Agreed.
Correct.
That's so good. Can you walk me through, this is an untraditional question. Can you walk me through or give me an example of just like a really hard day? Like those early on careers in technology, maybe a day that just did not work out or just like left you down.
All of COVID, probably would be some of my days that I think about, from the technical perspective. Although I would say that most of the days I've had that were hard had nothing to do with the technology. They had everything to do with human response, right? So, and sometimes that human response was mine, and sometimes it was the human response of others. So, so COVID and trying to meet the needs of kids and having families feel entitled to more, was hard, when you're trying to meet the needs of kids and families who think that they are, because they have a higher salary or higher things, that they deserve more than others. But I'll also say, under my realm as CTO, I was, and I did this in multiple positions as well. I managed our libraries, and defending a child's right to read. Sounds like you would not have to do that, but there was a lot of my career where that was the case, and allowing kids to read what they wanted to read, and allowing our staff to help students be seen, heard, and understood through that process. Those were the hardest days. So usually around things outside of the actual technical part of my job, more the adaptive part of my job.
Yeah, I kind of wanted you to touch base a little bit on that. We talked about that earlier today about just dealing with parents, and I'm assuming probably school board members, maybe even other chiefs in the school district, that pressure. Can you talk a little bit about what you did there, and then what was really, really challenging about that aspect?
Sure. So, as I said, I'm kind of a collaborator by nature. I really find, and it's my being an extrovert, right? I get energy out of other people and working with others and the whole process. I get a lot of energy out of process versus sitting behind my desk and doing nothing by myself or doing a lot of things by myself. So part of it for me has been wanting to collaborate with others who don't necessarily want to collaborate.
Yeah.
And some of the struggle with leading up and leading across. I was very fortunate in that I worked with a great school board who was very responsive and very respectful to the work that my team and I did. But, all the other pressures around that, upper management leadership are a struggle, and they drain your energy and sometimes make you question the job you're doing in the first place. And you have to kind of refocus yourself and ground yourself in the people that you work with and the work that you're doing or have done, to really kind of to understand that. Because, teaching is not an area where you go in and you've accomplished something every day.
Yeah.
Right? You don't see quite often in teaching or in leadership, you don't necessarily see something getting accomplished every single day. It's over time that you see the effects of the work that you do. So sometimes you just have to ground yourself in, hey, today I got an inbox of 0. I answered everybody who needed answering. Or sometimes it's look back at all the amazing work that your team has done over the last 6 months and celebrate that with them. So it's, that's how you have to kind of get around some of the harder days.
Yeah. So, I mean, a massive accomplishment in your career. You were the CTO of the 15th largest school district in the United States. Going from a school, you talked a little bit about your progression into that. Can you walk through like the steps? Because you said you later on in your career you became the CTO.
Sure. So teacher, teacher tech facilitator, curriculum, and then lead technology person for elementary. And then I left the district I was in, which had at that time, about 35 schools. And I went to a district about an hour west of me. And they had 80 schools. Mm-hmm. So double what I had. And I was their instructional technology director there. And focused directly on instructional technology. I worked with an amazing IT director and a data director there. Probably one of my favorite places I've ever worked, and just having people who were like-minded and were willing to kind of all roll up your sleeves and get work done. So I did that for about 5 years, and then switched for a brief. Everybody should have a blip on their resume. This one was mine. Yep. I went for 5 months with a district as their instructional technology person, and was being recruited by Wake at the time. So I didn't end up staying long. I ended up jumping. But I've done instructional technology and library media pretty much in the 3 jobs outside of Wake. And then I was recruited to Wake as their instructional technology and library media, and did that for 5 years before I became CTO.
Yeah, I would love to hear what is the difference between what you were doing with them before and then moving to the CTO role. Obviously moving maybe more into a technical role where you're dealing with maybe more critical issues. Can you talk a little bit about that and then the challenges with that transition?
Sure. So I had a small instructional technology team, and we were a really close-knit group when I was in Wake. And we did a lot of the training, a lot of the working with our academics team and other teams, making sure people were getting their digital literacy skills up. But when I took over the technology department, the whole technology services division, it was a huge step. And I don't think I appreciated that step at the time. Whereas I had become the face of technology in my instructional technology role. Now I had a whole lot of folks who were relying on me to make sure the mission of the entire department was being seen, heard, and understood, right? So at the time I had about 120 staff plus contractors, and I ended up, when I left as CTO, I had about 167 at the time with contractors in addition. But I think the hardest thing for me was knowing I come from an instructional background and getting the respect of understanding the technical. And I'll put this in one way. COSN, the Consortium of School Networking, has their framework of essential skills for CTOs, and they have it broken into basically 3 areas. You have the managing the technical environment, managing the educational environment, and you have the leadership and vision part of that, because you really have to have all 3 areas in order to be a CTO. I had the leadership, and I had the instructional, and I had the technical, but I had to earn my chops, right? So there were a lot of folks who came in and said, she doesn't know anything about this. And so really trying to listen, respect the knowledge of others, but also trust and verify when needed.
Yeah. So we're just in my career in the ed tech industry for the last 11 years, I've seen a massive transition from going from a heavier weight on being technical to more you're seeing people who started out as teachers working their way up, because there is like a sense of like you've been in the trenches and you know the actual small issues. And it's important to have that technical side, and there's some really, really great tech directors that maybe weren't teachers previously, but seeing a lot more of that movement up. In the military is something very similar. So I had the opportunity just to direct commission which is where you can just go in, do ROTC, and then you
Mm-hmm.
become an officer. But what people not in the military know is if you don't go through basic training in AIT, like it's like a stigma. It's like
Yes.
essentially of like, hey, you haven't gone through this.
You haven't earned your stripes. Yeah.
Your mental break, and that's why I went down that is because it's so funny because I've served with some great officers who are West Point grads and everything else, but it's like there is stuff said behind your back that's like, yeah, well, you didn't go through all of it. Like you're missing that aspect, that ability to relate at a lower level than you would be without that experience.
Well, I do think too, and part of the COSN leadership survey shows that we're getting more and more CTOs coming from the educational background, and I think a large part of that is education doesn't pay well. We've already kind of addressed that, and so a lot of folks who have high technical skills can go work in the technical field in private industry and make double, triple what they make in education. So I think we're seeing an increase in the education because we're not willing to pay for higher level folks. And not that, I'm an educator by trade, and I actually think having an educator in that role is hugely important because, as my superintendent told me when she hired me, I'm sending a message that teaching and learning is our business. Our business is not technology. Yep. It's not the ones and zeros. It's not the cables. It's not any of that. Our business is educating a child every day, every child every day. And so if we don't do that, then we're not completing the mission of the work that we do.
Well, you had talked earlier today about burnout, and that's something I hear from superintendents, tech directors is like, this isn't a 9-to-5 job.
No.
And on top of being able, I feel like I've seen a lot of CTOs go out to the private sector because like, hey, I can work Monday through Friday, 8 to 4.
Work from home
and get paid more, and I don't have to deal with the stress. Is there any sort of change in education that's helping to combat that of like having a better work-life balance, or do you feel like it's getting harder?
I think education as a industry is trying, just like all the other industries, right? We're talking now about, we're having conversations now that we've never had before about wellness, both for our students and for our staff. There are places where folks are looking at different ways to help, staff with that balance. Ultimately, though, I think it's always up to the supervisor and how that plays out, and whether that's the superintendent or a tech director or a principal or whoever it is, they make the biggest impact when it comes to work-life balance because they're the ones who should know their employees and know when they need and know how to help them when they're facing that burnout.
Yeah, I think there's two sides of the coin with that, and I've had a plethora of leaders throughout my military and then business career. There's two sides. There's the leaders that they work themselves to the bone. Like, I want to show you how to work hard. But that typically I've seen causes a culture of everyone else feels like they have to do the same, like first in, first out. And then there's the leaders who are really disciplined and organized. And it's like, hey, I'm going to go spend time with my family because that's important. And you guys should do that too.
I think there's a happy mix in there that you're not including. So I do believe, and hopefully my team would support me in this, so that when we needed to get work done, I was there in the center of it, and I was trying to help, as well as all of my leaders in our division, because we all pitch in and we all do an all hands on deck kind of approach. But I also very much so believe in a family-friendly approach. Yeah. And when you need time, you take time. So we've had, in the time I was leading, we had multiple folks with cancer or with parents who were ill or kids who had issues. And the answer is always go be with your family, go take care of that. We will be fine. We'll take care of whatever is sitting there, and please don't worry about it. And the only way people believe that is if you do it yourself. And so I am a very proud mama, and I let them know every time I was taking time to go be with my son or my husband, or if we had something going on with family. And I think you have to be vulnerable and show that to your staff in order for for people to feel like it's safe and okay to do that.
I fully agree with that. That's awesome. Personal question for you.
Sure.
You kind of tapped a little bit on mental health. What is your go-to? Like, describe to me maybe rough day, or like what do you do to recharge? What are some disciplines that you have set in place for you to get that like much needed like mental break and mental build?
Yeah, I think it's changing over time. So I'd say to you before COVID, I looked a lot like Olivia Pope. I don't know if you were ever a Scandal watcher, but she always had a glass of wine and popcorn. That was usually my go-to. And so I used to love that. But since COVID, that's not been the case. And so for me, spending time with family or friends has become something I've appreciated far more in the last few years. I won't lie, I love a spa treatment. So when I can find time to go do something like that, that's always on my list. And right now, since retirement, one of the things I do most is try to focus on my own health and look inward rather than trying to look for external things to do that. So I'm trying to eat right, although my lunch today did not show that.
Sorry.
It's okay. And trying to exercise more and trying to get my health back on track, right? Because I think quite often when we're going through burnout, our health is the first thing we kind of let slide. And I know I am certainly guilty of that. So kind of that's been one of my biggest things in the last few months is to really try to start getting a handle on all of that. So,
yeah, that's great. I mean, similarly, myself, going through like leadership, owning a business, and I think the hard thing about education is it's not like there is a seasonality to it of like spikes and it's sometimes hard to be disciplined in the day to day. And that's one area that's been so important is all those little decisions made makes a big difference on your mental dexterity and your ability to like really be present and be mentally sharp during those times.
absolutely.
Amazing. So you said COVID was a low point. You're a CTO of a massive district. And then eventually going to where you are now. Can you talk about that mental shift, that kind of the decision to step away from working directly with the district and what you're kind of looking forward to in this like next step?
Sure. So let me edit my statement a little bit in that COVID, literally, and this is going to sound so cheesy, was the best of times and the worst of times, right? So I have never been prouder to be a CTO of any district, but specifically ours, as the work that my team did during that time period. Our team came together and really and truly served the community in more than just devices, but vaccination clinics and home visits to make sure kids had what they needed. There was so many things that my team did that were just were spectacular, and I don't have another word for it. So in many ways, it was one of the best times. But I think what you'll hear from most tech directors or CTOs is that, or really anybody during that period of time, is there was a bit of adrenaline for the first year, right?
Yes.
That first year, we went at it like gangbusters, trying to make sure everybody had what they needed. I remember multiple nights where I was there until late at night. But that's what we did. And then the longer we were in COVID, at the beginning there was all this grace, like everybody was scared, everybody was kind. And then in about 6 months into COVID, everybody kind of turned, right? Grace was no longer something that people were giving. And so I think at that point in time, people were tired. We had been working hours upon hours upon hours. And then you get from there, we kind of switch somewhere in the middle of COVID to this absolute anti-education vitriol that's happening now, where teachers are the worst, education's the worst. We're doing all these bad things to kids. And I put all that in quotations because we're doing none of that, right? but no longer was teaching an honorable place to be. And everybody now, because we all lived through COVID, everybody now is an educator and knows what's best for everybody and anything. And so I think what we've seen over time is a huge amount of folks that are retiring or are leaving the career. There was a huge number of teachers who went to ed tech, right? They no longer had the wherewithal to continue to take the abuse and the time, especially those teachers who had families of their own that they were trying to manage at that same point in time. And I was no different, right? So I think I finally came to a point where I had multiple people tell me that I either didn't look well, that I could tell in my own behavior that I was frustrated and angry all the time. Not with parents, not with people, but I could feel it inside. And then that's when I thought, I don't know that I'm doing anybody any good, but specifically I'm not doing myself any good. And so that's why, that's when I finally just made the decision to step away and from K-12 specifically, K-12 public. Not that I'm not going to stay in the education field, but I needed to stop the 60, 80-hour weeks for a little while and focus on my health because, surprisingly, I'd like to live long enough to watch my son grow up. And that was something that, I wanted to be able to do.
Yeah, that's incredible. And thank you for your long career you had previously. It's funny because, you had said, it was only 30 years. That's a long time.
Yeah, but it was only 5 years as a CTO. And there's a bit of frustration at myself, honestly, that I feel that I wasn't able to do more. When I was debating on retiring, I had a pros and cons list, and one of my cons was there's so much left to do. And I wasn't going to retire for a while. And then finally, one of my really close friends said, there's always going to be more stuff to do. It's never going to be done. So you can't use that on your pros and cons list. And she was right. I just couldn't because it was neither a pro nor a con. It just was. Yeah. And so I couldn't use that.
It sounded like you had some really good people speaking into your life during your career. Do you have any specific advice or something someone has said to you during your career that's really helped you in being like maybe more focused?
I think there's a couple things of things that people have shared. One is, and this is just general, research, and that most times, for me, I didn't apply. We were talking about applying or not applying. When I didn't apply, it was because I didn't think I had the skill set to do it. And, there's research out there that most women don't think they can take the job until they have all the skills. Whereas men figure they're going to learn it on the job. And so what I had to start learning was stop thinking that just because I don't have the skill set means I can't do something. So that was a huge piece for me. The connections you make are so very, very valuable. And the idea that if you stay in your district and you do the work, that you will be successful in everything. And you might. But it is so much easier when you connect with other people and you have conversations and you problem solve together, because the truth of the matter is no matter the size, whether you're big or small, we're all going through the same issues. It's just scope. And so connecting with others, I wouldn't have survived COVID without a group of CTOs and CIOs across the country that every Friday we would have a conversation and we were like, how are you solving this problem? How are you solving that problem? And it made life so much easier and made COVID so much easier to be able to share resources and do things. So your connections and your network are, to me, everything about leadership. If you don't have a network, you need one. And part of the work I've done in a couple instances now is just connecting people. I was talking to a brand new principal. And so I was like, oh, I have a great principal for you to talk to. And so connecting the two people just so that they have somebody to talk to is hugely important.
Yeah, I have a saying for my employees is, if people want you to be successful, you'll be successful.
Yeah.
And people want you to be successful when you help other people.
Correct.
What are you going to use that power for? And like, if I look back over my career, I'm still in the infancy side of it. It has been because older men and women have taken a chance. Like, you know what? I like this kid that might not know 100% what he's doing, but I believe if he's in a position to help people, he's going to do it. And then also, the giver's gain. Like, if you are giving to others and you're taking and you're sacrificing for others, that will come back tenfold.
Well, mentorship is truly one of the best things. And honestly, I would say is probably one of the reasons I've been successful. I had two women who were more experienced, I'm going to say, in the field, and were CTOs and very successful ones in their own right, who one day came to me and said, hey, you're going to be one of the new COSN board members. And I kind of laughed at them, and they were like, no, for real, we've already kind of submitted your information. And they literally have pushed me through my career and, check in with me every now and then. And then I also had a boss who was male, who made sure, and I would say this about the two women too, when you're not in a room, you need people who know your name and can use your name in rooms that you're not in. Mm-hmm. And he was very good about doing that for me, and still to this day is a great mentor in doing that. And so I hope in many ways that I've been doing that for others, both men and women, in my career, is making sure that I'm always recruiting. I'm always looking. I love to poach people. It's one of my favorite things to do. But getting good talent you have to do that through networking, and that's the only way that works.
That's excellent. So now you're out. How have you enjoyed your time on the other side, at least a little bit, for the little bit of time you've had?
Sure. So most of it's been spent with family. I have a son who's going to college, his first year this year, and we're taking him to school next week. And I'm excited and nervous all at the same time. Yeah. But then just trying to figure out what my next career is. I am, and my husband was the same way. My identity was tied to who I was in work. Mm-hmm. And so trying to figure out now, if I'm not the CTO, or if I'm not a CTO or a tech director, who am I? And so I'm spending the next couple years, hopefully, trying to figure that out. Definitely staying in education, wanting to help and still move the mission forward with education. But then just trying to figure out what's next for me. And so I started a consulting company, and so we're going to see how that goes for a little while.
I know you will be successful.
Well,
I'm sure people will make sure of that. So moving, that's your origin story, and I love that. Just started from being a kindergarten teacher, such an important position, and then coming to this point, just helping at a massive district harness technology for education. So important. And I asked you what would be a good topic to talk about, because we'll break this up kind of into two pieces, sure. Right? The origin side and then the actual podcast side. And you had brought up, and I love that you brought this up, is the diversity in education technology and in ed tech leadership, and then honestly education leadership. And, really technology in general has had an issue with diversity. Can you talk a little bit about that, and then maybe where it's starting and maybe where there's some areas that could be improved?
Sure. So interestingly enough, diversity, equity, and inclusion are three areas that I spend a lot of time trying to learn more about. And I think it's not just in education. I don't think it's just in ed tech. I think these are conversations that are being held, across the world. And I think people recognize that we are the most powerful and the best people that we can be when we have a diverse group of perspectives and understandings around us. And so trying to figure out how to best meet that while also making sure there is equity for all, and that when we say all means all, that we're meeting those needs, and then making people feel, again, as we talked about with inclusion, being seen, heard, and understood. So in ed tech specifically, it's been interesting because I think quite often when we in ed tech talk, we're actually talking about equality, not equity. It used to drive me crazy. I'd be in a room full of tech directors and like, oh, we're focused on equity. We have one-to-one. Everybody has a device. And I'm like, that's not equity, right? That's equality. Everybody has the same. And so when we think about that, and then we think about understanding who people are, like equity and inclusion can't happen if you don't see people for who they are.
Yeah.
And so in this, in ed tech, I think it's specifically important because there are lots of people who are not being seen or who are not being included, specifically around women and people of color. We are a very white male industry, not just in technology, but also in education, especially education leadership. We have lots of women in education, but very few women in leadership. Yeah. So I think these all mirror each other in that process. And so really trying to focus on how do we bring more to the table, people, perspectives, ideas, and become better than what we are.
So earlier we were talking about like the big little things, and let's say that you were given the chair of education, and you could make a couple of small changes to help with this problem. What age group would you start, and what would be some messages that you would be sending out or education that you would be implementing to help with that process?
That's an interesting question because I don't know that I'd start with an age group because everybody's important, but I think I'd start with teachers because people who are seen, heard, and understood can see, hear, and understand. So if we're not doing that for the adults, then they can't do it for others. So I think from that perspective is understanding staff, understanding the needs of staff is still a huge piece that has to be done. As far as education is concerned, I don't like starting with a group because every student deserves to be seen, heard, and understood. So just saying kindergarten does or high school does means there's whole groups of people who are not being seen, heard, or understood. And that makes me sad. But I do know that, the story is, of taking a bite of an elephant at a time. How do you eat an elephant? You take one bite at a time. I think we have to start learning to be a little bit more creative. But I do think starting with staff is a huge piece of that. Not as a checklist, right? Diversity, equity, inclusion is not a checklist. It's a mindset, and it's understanding that each person has value. And then how do we bring that value forward, whether that's through different needs that people have, whether that's bringing them to the table, whether that's making them feel like they belong. All of those things are super important in that role. But my fear has always been and will continue to be that diversity, equity, inclusion becomes another one of the education or workplace things that we just, we did this, we're going to mark it off. Because that's not really what it is.
Yeah, I agree with that. So in your career, this is one of the questions I had. Can you share a story where because you had a good diverse group that helped you to make a more educated decision in
Sure.
ed tech. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll absolutely say, and I hate to keep kind of pounding this, but COVID, right? Having a diverse group of folks that we talked to, and we even included people outside of our division, talking with parents, having folks from differing backgrounds. I think all of that, anytime you can listen and hear what people are saying and they need, hugely helpful. And I don't think we could accomplish what we did without it. And it also taught my team as well. And let me explain that. Most technicians, technology people live in a cubicle or an office space, and they stay there, or in a data center, and they stay there. When COVID hit, everybody had to participate, and so everybody was out working with families. And honestly, a lot of staff didn't realize when they make decisions how those decisions affect families. And more than one time, I had staff come to me and say, I talked to this parent. This is what's happening. Can we change this because this makes more sense because the families need this? Absolutely, let's do that.
Yeah.
And I think having those diverse perspectives and exposing people to that really does make us stronger in that work. And COVID did that for us.
Yeah, it allows you to get past the surface and get down deeper to where the pain points are.
Correct.
That you might not be able to see if you didn't have that perspective.
Correct.
I love that. That's great. Why do you think that there's such a big disparity in ed tech when it comes to representation? And then are there any particular barriers or certain groups that it's hardest for?
History. History is the barrier quite often. Systems were built with one population in mind. And now that we understand the value proposition for other populations, there is a mentality in the world that if we give up our power, that they lose power rather than it increases my power. And so when we talk about this, and you and I were talking about the Barbie movie earlier, and
Yeah.
I haven't seen it yet, but it has been very polarizing for people who have seen it. But I do think a lot of the barriers we see are truly systemic things, like, for instance, maternity. Women who want to have children who have to take time off and stay home with kids. Well, just now recently, more paternity care is being given, right? More men are staying home. But that's a systemic thing. So when it comes to leadership, if you're taking care of your kids, you're not seen as a leader because you're not putting in the hours at work.
Yeah.
And so that's been a barrier. Some of the smallest things, kind of the death by 1,000 cuts, are the microaggressions that are out there right now. I cannot tell you how many of those I have experienced over my career. Simple things like being, even though I'm quite competent, being told how to do my job by somebody who thinks, a male who thinks I must not know that because I'm just a female.
Yeah.
Or being in a room with some of my male staff and someone coming in, a vendor coming into the office and introducing himself to the male because clearly the male is the CTO in the room. Hmm. Or things like taking credit for ideas that I have just said. Lots of things like that can happen, or, inappropriate jokes, or, being boxed out of a conversation by just a shoulder with a group of men, or just having male conversations that, some women aren't going to participate. I'm not going to talk about fishing. I'm probably not going to talk about golf either. But
me neither.
Yeah. But when we talk about those things, being more inclusive in how we do that are hugely important when we're looking at how do we make people feel like they belong. And if you don't feel like you don't belong, then people don't stay or people don't come. And you have to be able to see people. Like, I want to see, like, as one of the very few women in the top districts in the country, leading a school district, there weren't many like me. So how do we make sure that there are more, so that people are included? And I'm using myself as an example as women, but even less so people of color, and especially women of color in these roles.
What are some things, I know you're really involved with COSN and some other boards, what are some things from your experience that you've seen, or strategies or initiatives that you're seeing some movement in?
I think what we're starting to see is hiring, like in how we handle HR processes is probably one of the easiest. For one, just telling people that hiring diversity is important. Because when left to our own devices, as human beings, we gravitate to those people who are like us.
Yeah.
And understanding that one of the values we have as a company or as a district or as a school is to have diversity and pointing it out. For instance, I was at a concert just recently with my son, and we were visiting my parents. And I had him look around all the people. It was an outdoor concert, and I said, "Tell me what you don't see." And he looked around, and he said, "Mom, there's no people of color here." I said, "You're right." And sometimes just being intentional and showing people, okay, what don't we see? What are we not seeing? What perspectives aren't at the table? When you're hiring, looking at that is important. Who don't we have on our team? And then, some of the work around job descriptions and looking at job descriptions. The way we write job descriptions in this country, at least in K-12, is antiquated, right? We expect high education, we expect high experience, and you can't get the experience without, having the high education. And quite honestly, the high education costs a lot of money, and a lot of a lot of folks don't have the educational background to come from, but they have the experience, or they have the ability to what you and I were talking about before, which is they have the willingness to learn, and they have a work ethic. I'll take that any day over somebody with a degree or 5 degrees.
Yeah. So a question I had, and it's just how my mind kind of works for being proactive, and I don't know because I don't work for a school. Are schools do they have programs let's open up, we're going to do tech training for teachers who might be interested in being a tech director one day, and having people who are slotted, or is it just our tech director just left, we need to hire somebody today?
That's exactly that unfortunately is exactly the way most districts are. I joked earlier about constantly wanting to poach and recruit, but everywhere I go, I'm looking for talent. Mm-hmm. Not only because I may want to hire them one day, but because they make some of the best people. And so looking for a variety of people and understanding and mentoring folks who, succession planning is important.
Yeah, and that's surprising to me, and the world's changing quickly, and it might be something that's put into place in future years. But I don't know why schools don't have this is an assistant tech director, and maybe it's a teacher that teaches part-time and then is also learning part-time. Because if I'm thinking, when I think about a tech director, how important it's if I'm a superintendent, what if they leave? They have all the keys to the castle. Our network could go down, education could.
Oh, redundancy of people is the worst thing we have going for us in many cases, especially in the ed tech field. But I do think that there are people who are doing that. I think there's always a fear that there could be somebody better out there. And certainly you want to hire the best talent.
Yeah.
So whoever that best talent is who you want to hire. But I do think it's important to grow people. If as a leader you're not growing people and growing a variety of people, right, then you're not doing your job. People always would say, well, what if they leave? I celebrate that. Because if I've trained you enough and if I've gotten you to grow enough that you get to go out and leave and do something bigger and better for yourself, bravo.
Yeah. Typically, if you're leaving and you're leaving in the right way, you're leaving it well in place and where it can run itself. Typically.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct.
I love that. So, future outlook. Obviously, you're stepping into this new era of your career. Where do you see yourself playing into this issue that you're seeing, kind of long term, with your next step in career?
So, diversity, equity, and inclusion, as I said, is a passion. And I think there are so many things to be considered in that area, and not just in the HR perspectives, but in how we include kids, how we train teachers, how we grow leadership, how we provide materials to students. We want our kids to see materials that reflect them. So in my new role, I still believe and I still want to do that work. So it's my hope going forward that part of what I'll do is work with our education institutions, but also our ed tech companies who may or may not be putting out products that reflect the diversity of students, that make kids feel included, or that provide equitable solutions. So, so that's really, my thought process right now is trying to figure out ways that I can still plug in to make a bigger impact across both sets of folks.
Yeah, I love that. So on the series, I'm going to ask these 3 questions.
Okay.
Because this is what I love to talk about on a personal level. Favorite movie, favorite book, favorite show.
Favorite
and,
movie, favorite
and why?
book, favorite show. Oh, favorite movie's hard because I have lots of favorite movies.
Same.
So my family would probably say my favorite movie is probably The Replacements.
Okay.
Do you know the movie?
No.
All right. So it's an old Keanu Reeves movie, Gene Hackman. It's about NFL going on strike and the players who come in as the replacements. Anyway, funny movie, cheesy, all the things, great underdog story. If it comes on the TV, I can't not watch it.
That's
so I absolutely adore that movie, but I'm also, a huge Steel Magnolias fan as well. That's another one that I have to keep on if it comes on. But I probably have a list of 100 favorites. I'm also a big Marvel fan. The irony of that.
What's your favorite Marvel movie?
Oh, Black Panther.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Easy Black Panther. And then Endgame. I don't know why, because I cry through the whole movie, but Endgame is a good one too. And I like Miss Marvel too.
Yeah, Black Panther's up there for me. Thor Ragnarok's my favorite.
Oh, that's a good one too.
It's just because I laugh the whole time.
Yeah, it's is a good one.
Yeah. Favorite book?
Favorite book? Great question. I am going to pull from my my life of children's literature, and it was always "Love You Forever" by Robert Munsch, excuse me. And I like anything by Robert Munsch in general. Just because, and of course that one's near and dear to me right now, so I can say, it's about a son growing up and a mom who loves him. So I'm going to stick with that one for right now. Yeah. As far as a leadership book, I will say I do love The Iceberg is Melting, and that's a John Cotter book about change management. It's
I haven't read
book.
that one.
Yeah, it's an easy 20-minute read. It's a good one. Favorite show?
Yes.
So let me go with my if I'm doing nothing and I just want something on TV, I am a Law and Order NCIS freak. Like I'll watch them all. Like Special Victims is my favorite, and if my life is ever made into a TV series, Mariska Hargitay is going to play me. So
great.
Just gonna go with that. But as far as more shows I'm watching right now, I love Ted Lasso.
Yeah.
Of course, you can't not love Ted Lasso. Just finished Jack Ryan, which is great.
Yep.
And I'm watching Only Murders in the Building right now, which is actually
I haven't
pretty
seen.
good
I've heard
too.
good things though.
Yeah, it's pretty good too. So, as far as new series, so and I actually really really love Queer Eye, which is on Netflix, as well. That's great. It's a new group of guys, and I love a makeover story.
That's great.
So,
well, Marlo, I am so thankful you come out here to the Valparaiso studio to shoot this, and I'm really excited what you do with your career, and I wanted to say thank you for your 30 years you put in education, and I'm excited to see what you do with the next.
Yeah, me too. And I appreciate the getting to come out here. It's a great group, and you've got a great group of folks that work here, and so greatly appreciative of the conversation.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.